as I say in class sometimes, if you are not here for the workshop on religious education and evolution, you might want to go to another classroom, but I think I recognize everybody here and you're supposed to be here. This is a more online event than in-person one, it looks like. Wish you all could be here in the room with us, but glad to have you wherever you may be. And I see some exciting backgrounds here, virtual backgrounds and real ones as well. So tonight we are working on religious education and how to incorporate science into what we do. And Jim Miller is again our guest from the Smithsonian team. He is co-chair of the broader Social Impacts Committee of the Hall of Human Origins and has been a part of the dialogue on science, ethics, and ritual at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Any other cool things you want me to tell them about you?
Well, two things, I guess, maybe. One is I was the founding and secretary treasurer of what's called the Presbyterian Association on Science, Technology, and Christian Faith. And surprise, surprise, without being a scientist, I was elected a fellow of the AAAS 2020. So you live long enough and hang around with the folks long enough.
Exactly. That's how I did it. Yeah. And I should ask you to speak a little louder.
Sure.
Because we'll get clearer voice quality across the internet.
I will try to do that, and you'll pardon my Willie Nelson voice. It just has gotten this way over the last number of years. So anyway, what I'm going to do this evening is to share with you a PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully there'll be time at the end of it, because I'm not going to show all of it to you because there's too much in it to show. But it's basically going to be an introduction to the broad field of science and religion, because you need to start there in order to begin to focus on particular topics. And then we'll look at, in fact, you'll get to choose what particular topic we want to look at in all of this. And if you'll pardon a little bit of I suppose, self-promotion. One of the things I'll be using here is a book that I've written that was aimed specifically for use in congregational settings, and ostensibly is a resource for parents to talk to their children about science and religion matters. And there are a couple of chapters in it that will be germane to dealing with human origins. And so we'll look at least one of those, and like I said, y'all can choose which ones you'd like to take a look at. So with that having been said, let me share my screen. Move this bit. There we go, down here. There we go.
First question of the evening: how many desktop icons are too many?
So long as you have one for each space.
Okay.
So long as they're not on top of each other. And I've just about hit the limit here, I think.
Yes.
But we'll see how that goes. Okay. Here we go. And, yeah. Now I just change the. I don't do this often enough to be able to be good at it. There we go. All right. What does it mean to be human education in a scientific and technological age? Christian education. There's a lot of opportunity or need for this. There are not a lot of resources for it. The last 75 years or so of scholarship in the area of science and religion has produced a tremendous amount of work. My colleague here is one of those who's contributed important pieces of that scholarship. But there has been relatively little material, particularly by mainstream religious communities, for use in congregations. Even less so in terms of relationship with youth and children per se. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. What I want to do is to begin by talking broadly about how we can think about the science-religion relationship, which is a part of understanding our history, at least Western history. I'm not going to be dealing with Eastern traditions so much. That is an important topic, but it's larger than I think would be germane for our particular discussion. I'm not going to be talking really about other religious traditions, non-Christian traditions, for two reasons. One is I have less knowledge of that, so that is a good reason not to talk too much about it. The other reason is in terms of issues around human origins in a religious context, it has tended to be, particularly amongst Christians, that this has been an issue for theological and religious reasons. So that's what we're going to be getting at somewhat here. Okay, who are we and why are we here? This is not the ultimate existential question.
It is though.
But basically it was thinking we might have a room full of people or a bunch of people online. I would be interested in knowing who Bruce is, and Connie was on here, but I don't see her now. But I'd just be interested in knowing Bruce. It says MD at the end of it, so I'm assuming that means that you're a medical doctor. And you're muted. You're muted, Bruce.
Okay. Yeah, I'm unmuting myself now. Yes, I'm a retired pediatrician, and looking forward to this discussion.
Oh, very good. Thank you.
And Connie is still with us. She just turned off her camera.
Okay. I just didn't see her listed there anywhere. Anyway. Well, great. Connie, would you want to, would you share kind of why you're here and who you are?
I'm Connie Harrison. I am fascinated by your topics and have been for as long as I can remember, and that's why I'm here. And I'm also driving, so that's why I had to not let you see all my expressions with crazy traffic. And,
well, be very careful.
I am fine. You're going to sit on the armrest, so I'll be just fine.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad that y'all are here, and we'll see how this goes, and I'll welcome any feedback that you would like to give me. I will say at the very beginning, those of you who have not done so, if you would are interested in having a copy of the book that I'll be talking about a little bit later, and other resources related to science religion that I can provide that might be useful in congregational settings, then please send in the chat line, send your email address and your name, and I will send these materials to you either by mail with the book or by probably a Dropbox folder or something like that to you.
Yeah, and if people prefer that others not see their email addresses, they can, instead of sending it to everyone, just use the drop-down menu to send to Nancy Howell, and that will be kept private.
Okay, great. And I will also, well, I can do that with the Dropbox thing, is provide you a copy of this presentation too, for people. They can have the nice thing about things, if you don't need it, it's easy to delete them, even if you're not intending to. So, okay, now we'll skip the session schedule because we'll just, I think we'll be able to go through it now. So, starting question is, why should the church be interested in science? I mean, why in the world should that be a matter of concern? Well, I want to start with a quote. Know the mighty works of God, comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate in degree the wonderful working of his laws. Surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more grateful than knowledge. These are words attributed to Copernicus. And I really love the last phrase, to whom ignorance cannot be more grateful than knowledge. This was a motivation for many of those in the late Middle Ages, the very beginning of the modern age, for their actual study of nature, as they saw that as an act of appreciation for the creation, for God's creation, and increasing knowledge about it. was a worthwhile thing to do. Oops. See if I can go back here and get this. Oh, I can't see it, okay. About the earth and the heavens. It says even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, and other parts of the world, about the motions and orbits of the stars, and even their sizes and distances. And this knowledge he holds with certainty from reason and experience. It is thus offensive and disgraceful for an unbeliever to hear a Christian talk nonsense about such things, claiming that what he is saying is based in Scripture. We should do all that we can to avoid such an embarrassing situation, which people see as ignorance in the Christian and laugh to scorn. Actually, this was a softer criticism than he has slightly later on. And this comes from St. Augustine in the 5th century, or 5th century. And comes from his book on the literal meaning of Genesis. So why is it that Christians should be concerned and the church should be concerned is because you don't want to say stupid things about God's creation, which as a matter of fact then discourage people from wanting to be a part of your community. Okay, what I want to touch on, at least I could touch on, and I won't touch on all these necessarily, but a series of 6 different sort of theological questions. One is, what is about the science, religion, and theology, or science-religion relationship itself? Secondly, the historicity of Adam and Eve. Thirdly, the image of God. Fourth, the notion of divine providence. Theodicy, a perennial concern and issue for those both within and outside the church. Stewardship of the earth. So these sort of 6 topics will be topics that we'll, at least some of them we'll take a look at. You can turn these into theological questions, which would be something like competitors, acquaintances, or companions. Adam and Lucy. What does God look like? Plan or accident? Why did they have to die? Those will be dinosaurs, by the way, when we get to that. We won't get to it. Are we really in charge? So this is turning those sort of big theological, more abstract questions into questions that people might actually ask. What we're going to start out with is this one. And I'm just going to take you through this one, and then we can choose if any want to look at any of the other ones. I might just say that since the very early days of the initiation of real serious ongoing scholarship in the area of science and religion, which is about 75 years now, almost everybody early on was doing their typology of science and religion. And it came down to probably the majority of them ended up being either a 3-part or a 2 or a 4-part typology. I'm just going to be working with the 2-part one, but so we'll see how that goes. Now, can you see that whole screen? You don't see this little thing at the top. I'm going to actually click it off so I don't have to see it. All right, there we go. I have a family of 4. I don't have a family. Well, I have a family of 4 now, but this story, the book that I'm talking about, has a family of 4. And I want to see if we can do some role playing here. So we need a father, that's Jack. We need a wife, that's Liz. We'll need a son, an older son, that's going to be Will. And we will need a somewhat younger girl, probably late elementary school, whose name is Diana. So are there any volunteers who will take a role?
Sure, I'll take a role.
Which one would you like?
Probably not Jack, I'll take one of the other ones.
Well, you can have either Liz or you either the mother of the younger girl.
I'll take the younger girl.
That's Diana.
Okay.
Okay. I can play one of the roles if it's necessary.
I'll take the one if you
You
want.
take Liz?
Sure.
Okay, you'll be Liz. So we just need Will.
I'll take Will.
Take
Will's
Will.
Will's the little boy.
Okay, now for each one of these, and this is a characteristic of the book I'm talking about, each chapter begins and ends with a narrative within the context of this family that raises the question that's to be addressed. And this is a new way of me presenting. I've never done this before, so we'll see how well it goes. So what I'll do is start with a narrative, and you have to keep your eyes open so you can.
Is this scripted? So-
It's scripted.
Okay, making your jobs easier.
And it's going to line out. It's not going to be one whole thing shown up at one time. So
Okay.
hopefully it'll make it easier to read.
Got it.
We'll see. So we're going to start out with Jack. That's me.
That's you.
Okay. Whoops. I don't get it, Liz. Here is another report in the paper about controversy in a school district over teaching evolution. I mean, sure, there have been conflicts in the past, but aren't science and religion basically different things? I mean, if they deal with different questions and have different methods, then how can they conflict? What is there to argue about?
All right. Well, you know, Jack, Pastor Mike seemed to agree with you in his sermon last week. He was talking about science and religion being two ways of knowing that are different, but complementary. But then I started wondering, if they're so separate, why do some religious people seem to think that science challenges their beliefs? I have to say that sometimes I wonder if we live in one world on Sunday and another world the other 6 days of the week.
So one of the points of view that people have is that of competitors. And I think if you scratch the surface and just ask folks out there in general, not to what do you think, but what do you think the public, what is the
What do
public
you think
view
other
of-
people think?
What do
Yeah.
you think other people think?
Yeah.
They'll often say that there's a conflict between science. That's what they say. You know, it's just one is sort of out to get the other in one way or another, and it's coming from both sides. So it's not just one banging on the other. And often they will cite Galileo's trial with the Roman Inquisition back in 1633, in which he was convicted by virtue of insisting that the earth went around the sun, which had been proposed by Copernicus in a little paper that nobody found particularly troublesome. But he was a very passionate expounder of this particular view, and particularly after he was told by the church not to expound it as a certainty, but you could talk about it as something else. Unfortunately, he wrote a book called Dialogues on the Two Great World Systems, in which he uses the language of the Pope in a character whose name is Simplicicus. And that probably hastened his going before the trial. And it was clear that he was teaching a Copernican perspective in his writings at that time. Anyhow, I have a former colleague who passed away now who wrote about this particular area in the history of science and science and religion. And one of the things he said was Galileo got what he deserved because he insisted on a theory for which he had no evidence. It was 100 and some years after that there was actually evidence for it. Anyhow, the other conflict is sort of the icon conflict, is the Scopes trial. Thomas Scopes, who only passed away in 1970. So, and resulted in a famous trial that was held, at least in part outdoors, because it was so hot, in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. This is an image of Clarence Darrow standing on the right, examining William Jennings Bryan, a 4-time candidate for president of the United States, one of the great orators of his day. And these two icons are often used to show that obviously science and religion inherently conflict with one another. As it turns out, careful historical examination of both of these events shows that that's not the case. As I said before, Galileo, the Jesuits who were in charge of the Jesuit astronomy at that particular time, perfectly willing to accept the fact that they could see moons going around Jupiter. That raised important questions about arithmetic and natural philosophy, but it didn't demonstrate the fact that the Earth went around the sun. And try as he might, Galileo couldn't come up with it. And in the Darrow case, the state of Tennessee had just passed a law banning the teaching of human evolution, and the newly formed ACLU wanted a test case. And the church, the city fathers, and I think they were all fathers of Dayton, Tennessee, said we can put our city on the map if we, as a matter of fact, provide that case. And so they persuaded John Scopes, who was actually doing he was a basketball coach and he was doing substitute teaching in a biology course with a book that included evolution. It's not at all clear that he ever actually taught that, but nevertheless, he was chosen as the test case. And in the long run, he was convicted. The conviction was later overturned on a technicality, but it actually ended up leading to a much wider expression of legislative actions banning the teaching of evolution. Now, here's another more contemporary example. The American public has largely been duped into thinking that by not mentioning God or the Bible, something like the Smithsonian is being neutral. But there is no neutral position. One is either for Christ or against. The text there. This museum is imposing a religion on generations of Americans, the religion of atheism. It's the same worldview that is being thrust at generations of children in the public schools. This was a comment made by Ken Ham, as the founder of Answers in Genesis, and also the development of the Creation Museum in near Franklin, Kentucky. And he was commenting on the opening of the permanent exhibit on human origins at the Smithsonian. That was in 2010. And then there's the opposite fashion. It is fashionable to wax apocalyptic about the threat to humanity posed by AIDS virus, mad cow disease, and many others. But I think a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. These, of course, the words of our favorite atheist, Richard Dawkins, in a magazine article in the Humanist. It's interesting when Dawkins actually interacts with people in the science religion field, scholars in the science field, who are themselves perhaps both scientists and ordained clergy. He's much softer in his relationship with them than he is with his target. Here is largely that portion of the Christian community that is very much set against evolution. But he doesn't make that distinction. So that's those are sort of examples of the conflict perspective. What about acquaintances? This is where if you ask people individually, well, what do you think about the relationship of science and religion? Well, a lot of folks like science. I mean, just in general, they watch Nova, they watch, Smithsonian or National Geographic shows. And they're members of a congregation. I mean, most Americans, the vast majority of Americans still are members of one religious community or another. And for the most part, Americans really like science, despite current indication. So they see these things as separate, as really being in two different parts. Science is on one side and religion on the other, and there is a solid wall between. Now, the origin of this actually goes back in a time that's shortly after the beginning of what we call modern science. But anyhow, science and theology basic are two ways of knowing. You heard that earlier quote when we were talking about in the family that I think it was either Liz or Jack said that the pastor had talked about them being two ways of knowing. these largely are rooted in the 16th, 17th centuries, 18th century, with René Descartes, who was one, and Immanuel Kant was the other. These got so deeply rooted that people still hold these views today, even though they have forgotten completely where the sources of these ideas are. And so you have this sort of modern dualism. So you have matter on one side and spirit on the other, body and mind, soul, phenomena, noumena, knowledge, faith, facts, values, objects, subject, reason, passion, physics, metaphysics, technology, art, and therefore science on one side, religion on the other, and this impermeable barrier between. Someone earlier today, I said it's sort of the Robert Frost theory of the relationship of science and religion. Strong walls make good neighbors. Now, there's some contemporary spokespeople. The late John Paul II, for instance, wrote this: the sciences of observation describe and measure with ever greater precision the many manifestations of life and write them down along the timeline, while theology seeks to clarify the ultimate meaning of the Creator's designs. This comes from an address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, 1996. It's a great piece. It's also the one in which he said that evolution is more than a hypothesis. And basically, it was the first sort of formal affirmation on the part of the Roman Catholic Church from the Vatican, from the Pope, of the legitimacy of an evolutionary theory. But you can see that it's limited here to a certain domain, a certain area, while theology does something else or religion does something else. Interestingly enough, in response, there was a lot of hoo-ha in the press about the fact that the Pope had made this statement. And Stephen Jay Gould, who's an American paleontologist, the late Stephen Jay Gould, was surprised there was such a hoo-ha about it, because he then went on and wrote in an article, the lack of conflict between science and religion arises from the lack of overlap between their respective domains of professional expertise. Science in the empirical constitution of the universe, and religion in the search for proper ethical value and the spiritual meaning of our lives. This comes from an article titled Non-Overlapping Magisteria in Natural History in 1997. Non-overlapping magisteria has been shortened to the acronym NOMA. And you'll often hear people use that, and what they're referencing is this perspective that you see both in Gould and in the Pope, that science and religion are both good things, they just have to be completely separate and don't overlap. So they don't really have anything to do with each other. Companions. Okay, this is the third possibility, and this is an alternative, and it's one that sees the relationship between the two as being mutually constructive. It doesn't see science and religion as the same thing, nor does it see them as somehow coming together to make one thing, but they bear on one another. But they bear on one another in different places, and they affect one another and make a difference to one another. And a couple of examples of this is a favorite quote from Albert Einstein: "Science without religion is lame," and then "Religion without science is blind," which suggests that somehow they both need each other to be fully operational. What's important to understand here, and this would certainly be true for Einstein, is that it's not necessarily the case that science creates religion. We'll see that in a minute, but even if it bears on it, has an impact on it. Nor is it the case that religion has a bearing on the scientific enterprise, even though it may deal with the conditions necessary for the doing of science. Another interesting quote is from Holmes Rawson, the late Holmes Rawson III, just passed away just a few weeks ago. In his Science Religion Critical Survey, he wrote, "Religion that is married to science today will be a widow tomorrow. On the other hand, but religion that is divorced from science today will leave no offspring." Which is to say that you can't tie your theology or religion to the scientific kite because it's eventually going to crash. That is, it's going to be superseded by new science. On the other hand, if you don't pay attention to science with regard to religion, then your religious perspective becomes less and less credible, and therefore propagating to new generations. So are the two different ways of knowing, or is there another way of thinking about the relationship? Well, one might think of it as a nested relationship. So if you think about the different sort of scientific domains, might begin with mathematics at one level. And you need mathematics in order to do physics. And you need to have sort of a background in physics to do chemistry. And in order to do chemistry, geology really relies both on physics and chemistry and mathematics. And biology relies on chemistry and geology, chemistry, physics, and mathematics. And the social sciences, assume all of that other stuff. And philosophical cosmology, which is sort of, what's the general set of ideas for everything that there is, have to pay attention to everything that the other sciences say that it is. And I would argue at any rate that theology requires its attention to everything else. So if you have this, and someone was talking about the ladder earlier today, the kind of Aristotelian ladder, chain of being, that sort of thing. I don't want to reference that here, but it is something to suggest that the upper levels here set theoretical limitations on the lower. So whatever physics says about the structure of the physical world can't deny the possibility of biology because we know that biology is here. It can't deny biological creatures because we see biological creatures around us. So whatever theoretically you say in physics has to allow the possibility of everything that's above it. But on the other hand, the lower set conditions of credibility for the higher. So we'll take this for theology. If theology doesn't take seriously what we found out in terms of geology and chemistry and physics and biology, then its credibility is undermined. Now, this is, again, not the separatist point of view where these things are kept separate, but is one in which you see that these things bear on one another. They're not the same thing. They're not moving towards some sort of Hegelian unity, but they affect and have significance for one another. When we speak of a theology of modern science, it obviously does not mean that by itself science can determine an image of God and a religion. But what it does mean, if I'm not mistaken, is that given a certain development of science, certain representations of God and certain forms of worship are ruled out as not being homogeneous with the dimensions of the universe known to our experience. This notion of homogeneity is without doubt of central importance in intellectual, moral, and mystical life. Even though the various stages of our interior life cannot be expressed strictly in terms of one another. On the other hand, they must agree in scale, in nature, and tonality. I love that word, tonality. Otherwise, it would be impossible to develop a true spiritual unity in ourselves. And that is perhaps the most legitimate, the most imperative, and the most definitive of the demands made by man of today and man of tomorrow. This is a quote from Teilhard de Chardin, French paleontologist, Jesuit French paleontologist, was involved in the discovery of Peking man. Homo erectus, I guess, is what Peking man was. That's right, isn't it, Brianna? Brianna's doing something else.
Sorry. Texting my son, I apologize.
In a set of essays called Science of Christ that he wrote in 1947. So the idea that, this is from the point of view of theology, that theology needs to find a way of relating these things. So here you have the three alternatives that are kind of represented. They're much more nuanced ways you can divide these up and so forth. I've got one that I have actually 4 subcategories under each one of these things, but But these are just basic ways of thinking about it, which are probably sufficient.
Confirming.
Confirming, thank you. So we're back to Jack and Liz. You know, Jack, oh, I'm sorry, that should be Liz.
All right, you want me to read that one?
Yeah,
You know, Jack, I think there are other parents in our church who also wonder about these things. Maybe we could get Pastor Mike to help us organize a discussion group that could think and talk about these kinds of questions together.
that sounds like a good idea. You know, we might also talk about how we can respond to our kids when they ask us questions about our Christian faith and the understanding of nature that science provides. You can obviously see this is still a work in progress. Okay, this is the book I was talking about, and everybody who has either given Nancy an email address or earlier, I'm going to send you a copy of this, and hopefully you'll find it of interest. But those earlier questions that we looked at, those are the questions that provide the basic outline of this particular book. It has this kind of structure to it. There's a question from a child. There's a discussion of the relevant science and/or theological, philosophical matters. And then there's an answer from the parent. It's important to understand it's an answer, not the answer. It's people who read this, they may come up with another answer that would work for them better than what I have here. And then at the end of that, there are a series of discussion questions. I mean, what could you have in terms of a classroom experience where people read something and then you have a discussion question. And then, instead of a glossary at the end, because there are terms in here that may not be necessarily familiar to people, or there may be subjects that people would like to have more information about. Well, there is a list of resources at the end, but there's also a section, sort of like an extended glossary called Moral of the Story, where it takes any one of those. It may be biographical information about the name, one of the people that's in it. It may be a topic about organization or organisms like tiglons or leaders, which are crossbred tigers and lions. Depends on whether the mother and the father was a tiger or what. Okay, and there are additional resources. There are books that are listed, and there's online resources. I have to confess that the book was written in 1918, so I'm not. Not that old.
Not that book.
In 2018, so there is it's not completely up to date. I probably what you do is go in and update it. Maybe I'll get to that. So those are the questions. Now, well, we'll do. Let's see. We've got it till what, 8 o'clock? Yeah, 6:30. Okay, we can at least do one or maybe two of these. Is there any particular topic that y'all would like to? Any question that you'd like to look at?
I'd like to do Adam and Lucy, but
Okay,
that's just,
that's the next one.
other people may have other opinions.
Does anybody? Well, let's pick two. What would be the other one? We'll get through two of them. Anyone? Yeah.
Why did they have to die?
Why did they have to die? The Odyssey. Oh, already a good one.
Yeah.
He loves the Odyssey.
Yeah. Okay, let's do Adam and Lucy first.
Okay.
Come on. There you go. What is God? No, I'm sorry. It's not behaving itself. I'm just going to have to go in here and force it. Typically, the controls on here don't work the same way when it's plugged in.
Yeah, it'd be the version.
Okay, it's obviously it's not scrolling, so Will, we will start with you on this one.
Okay, except I can't see it.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah,
Did you stop your share, pause it or something?
maybe,
maybe.
maybe I didn't need to do that.
We'll take whatever we get. I can just make something up.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I was gonna ask, what's a paper?
There it is.
There it is.
Yeah,
I could start reading more. There it is.
Mom, I don't get it. Pastor Mike kept talking about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as though they were real people. But in my biology class at school, Ms. Kennedy said that human beings evolved over 6 million years in Africa. Which is it?
Well, it's a bit complicated, but maybe both are true in a sense, but in different ways.
Okay, and where we have to start with this is talking about how you understand the Bible, because that becomes a starting issue with regard to answering this question. And there are at least two different ways in which people argue. The Bible can be seen as inerrant, which that is to say is literally true in every respect. The other one is to see that the Bible is infallible, which is to say it does not fail to accomplish its goal. Or go back to Augustine again. Always go back to Augustine for something, at least in the West. And what Augustine argued for, that was part of what was reflected in that quote that we had, is a principle of interpretation of the Bible that could be called a principle of accommodation. That's where the plain reading of the text would be preferred. Straight reading, what the text says in ordinary language is preferred. However, but if contrary to reason and or experience, then an alternative reading is permitted. That was where he was talking about, there are other people who aren't Christians who know that the world is a certain sort of way, and so that they hear Christians interpreting the scripture to say something contrary to that, that's not good for the Christians. And that's this notion that the scripture was written in a way to be communicated to the people of its time in which it was written, not necessarily a future generation that includes new understandings of what creation is like. Now, interestingly enough, both Luther and Calvin did not accept a Copernican view of the world, but they objected to it not on biblical grounds, they objected to it on common sense grounds. You get up in the morning, the sun comes up over here, and then it goes over there and sunsets. And the earth is just here, it doesn't move. I mean, earthquakes, things like that, or romantic relationships or something like that. But as far as experiencing the earth spinning, we don't. So common sense simply says that the Copernican view is a mistake. Now, it turns out that's not the case, and there ultimately was empirical evidence to support that the earth, as a matter of fact, did go around the sun. And by virtue of that, and the fact that you've got daylight, nighttime, and so forth, it also spins on its axis. That twofold motion. That had been proposed way back in pre-Christian times by the Pythagoreans. But it wasn't recovered until Copernicus hypothesized it for various reasons. And then it was actually demonstrated about 124 years after, when they finally got the instruments that were fine enough to be able to do the measurements necessary to observe the fact that this was the case. It's often the instruments that lag in terms of being able to discover something.
Yeah.
So now there are two creation stories in Genesis. There's 1 through 2:4a, and then the rest of chapter 2. The first one, Genesis 1 to 2:4a, is the one about the creation of the world and the story of step by step, and finally ends up on human beings. It doesn't recognize them by name; it simply creates them male and female. It's chapter 2 in which you begin to get this story, and that is where it has to do with the apple, the tree, and the fall. Adam is created first from the dust of the earth. The name Adam is ostensibly drawn from the word for earth or dirt, Adama. He's sort of named for his origin. And he's placed in a garden that was already planted by God. And then later, Eve was created. But what and this is sort of a direct, the creation by God. And I love this picture. Because it's, and the line is, it is not good for the man to be alone.
Mhm.
Which I think, as a matter of fact, is one of those early demonstrations of the recognition that human beings, most human beings are a social animal.
Mhm.
And it's simply a recognition within the context of a creation story of that being the case. So God creates all the animals and brings them to Adam, and he has to give them a name. You can see how perplexed he is. Unfortunately, this is a mural that no longer exists. It was on a wall in a building that ultimately got destroyed.
Hmm.
Nobody thought to preserve it.
Where?
Hmm.
I think it was in England, but it may have been in France. I can't remember now where the location is. But I really love it.
Mhm.
And also in the Jewish or Hebrew context, a name is not simply a label. In the Greek context, a name is a label. You put something on it, so the next time you see it, you can call it what it is.
Mhm.
In the Jewish context, a name is to its meaningness. So for Adam to give the animals their name, meaning in some sense, he's finishing their creation. But of course, it didn't do any good because none of them were fit one for him. So Adam is, Eve is created out of Adam, so they are the same species. So you're not going to have cross species reproduction here. You're going to have interspecies reproduction. Now, that's the biblical story. There were other stories of creation along the way, or other stories of how to understand the structure and order of the world. One of them, and one of the most influential one, was that by Aristotle, who was Plato's student and also the teacher of Alexander the Great. And he came up with the whole notion of the ladder of life. So at the bottom, you have minerals, you have plants, you have animals, and who's at the top? We are. Now, later on, in the 18th century, there was a much more careful, detailed, and precise description of, or laying out the kind of structure of the living world. And Charles Linnaeus is one. In fact, Linnaeus' system, I guess, is still, at least in part, still used today, even with much more knowledge about these things than we knew before. But taxonomy is the systematic classification of things, and this was one of Linnaeus' contribution. It was said that God created and Linnaeus organized. And that's where we get kingdom, class, order, genus, species, these sets of nested relationships. Then in the 19th century, along comes Darwin, writes in 1859, publishes The Origin of Species, in which he has this first sort of tree of life sketch. Our sketch is a little bit more complicated nowadays than it was then, and of course, this is even just a smidgen of sort of the range of creatures that are alive today, or have been alive in the past and are not alive today. You still see that Darwin ends up being at the top of the list. It's a kind of species prejudice, I think, that we've got. Well, what we've learned is we have this relationship amongst the great apes, and in terms of their genetic relationships, and you can see from this chart that the hominids are essentially, all of these are hominids. You can correct me on this if I'm mistaken.
That's
All
right.
of these are hominids. But the group that the hominins are rather this group, the group that has split off, where our line of evolutionary development split from that of the chimpanzees and bonobos, our common ancestor. Everything that developed since then, and that's all. So many of those images that we have there are hominins. And you can see there were a lot of those kinds that we finally end up showing.
Is it because of the number of chromosomes?
Hmm?
Is it
Yeah.
because of the number of the chromosomes?
Yeah,
Yeah,
number of
that's a
chromosomes.
main
That's
division
one
between
way
us
of
and other
differentiating.
great apes.
Paleontologists hate this picture.
Yeah, we do, but that's okay.
I'm not gonna
It's the
use it,
March of
I'm just
Man.
pointing out that people.
I know, it's okay.
Because it gives us those just sort of singular lines.
Yeah,
going
exactly.
forward. But it's probably not like this anyhow, I mean, this in terms of where we're living today.
Yeah.
But what we really do have, and this is what you do see out there, is this group of evolutionary developments starting 6 or 7 million years ago. And this is, I think, maybe where that question about the missing link
Yeah,
may have come.
yeah.
And every now and then you'll see paleoanthropologists who want to draw lines. But then there'll be another one who draws the lines differently, so,
Exactly.
but this shows that the time in which the earliest and the latest fossils have been discovered. And you notice it's fuzzy on the both of those, because it could easily be, not gonna say easily, but there could be discoveries that would lengthen that. Part of what I find, is, I may have said earlier, the Homo erectus are my heroes, they lasted almost 2 million years. We've barely gotten, into we weren't eaten out of our childhood as a species compared to them. You also notice, which I think is interesting, that a number of these species co-inhabited the Earth. They were all present on the Earth at the same time. But as our Frederick Protz likes to say, we're the last biped standing. Last biped standing.
And the colors on there, by the way, are sort of those bigger groups of things that are probably more closely related. So like the green things are more closely related to the other green ones and that sort of thing.
But there's something to say about
Just by regions of where they were found?
No,
Or-
probably just by how they look, by how their skeletons look, so.
It's also just as a side worth noting that Homo erectus was it the first species that we know of that actually left Africa?
Correct, yeah, so actually everything before 2 million years is all in Africa.
Hmm. And Homo erectus got as far as Java and China.
Indonesia, that's right.
China.
Mhm. Yeah,
In terms of their.
East Asia, Southeast Asia, yeah.
There we are. The last biped standing. And this is one of the more recent ones, Homo luzoniensis.
Luzonensis.
And that's a fairly recent discovery. I mean, it's only the last, 5 years?
Couple of years, yeah.
Couple of years. And that's the thing, there's
Yeah, that one's on an island, another Philippines, from the
Philippines.
Philippines,
That's
yeah,
why it's Luzon.
yeah.
What you don't see on here are the Denisovans, which you may have heard of, and it's because they haven't been identified as a species
A group
yet.
called Denisovans.
Denisovans.
So it's,
identified as what?
They've not been identified as a species yet. But ironically, we do have their genome.
Huh.
So we can compare their genome with our genome and also with Neanderthals' genome, and it's not the same as either of ours. So it's its own thing, whatever it is. And I'm not sure, what are the criteria? It's only from very, very small skeletal samples that they have that they've been able to extract the DNA so they can tell what genome
there's
is.
no good skull, and oftentimes species are named on skulls because they look different enough from other species, and so there's no good skull yet from this group, the Denisovans. They were first discovered because there's a cave in Siberia, Denisova Cave, where human fossils, modern human fossils, and Neanderthal fossils were found, and they were sequencing the DNA from different layers from fossils in this cave, and they found this thing that's not a human and it's not a Neanderthal. So it was found basically based on genetic material from tiny bits of bone.
No, I think there has been some discovery or some discussions of some recent finds, but the community hasn't settled on.
Exactly, whether they are
whether or not,
Denisovan.
yeah. But we also know that there has been interbreeding between Neanderthals and Denisovans.
And modern humans,
and modern
all
humans,
three.
all three.
Yeah.
Must have been party time.
Exactly.
Oh, I'm sure they were all very dignified relationships,
Well, someone has said.
consecrated by the church.
Well, someone has once said, if you put put a Neanderthal in a Brooks Brothers suit, they would think they were somebody who worked on Wall Street. Okay. Well, here are some of the reconstructions of these creatures. And that's the one that's identified as Lucy, that is Australopithecus afarensis. John Gershie, who's a forensic artist, is the one who created these images.
They're really.
They have skulls of these. I think all of these are located in the permanent exhibit in the Smithsonian. And what I find interesting too, they have them at the height of what they understand these to be. And she's about our height. I mean, she's about 6 feet. She's tall.
Why is Lucy the only one with the name?
So the individual on which that head was reconstructed happens to be from a skeleton with a nickname.
Oh,
So a lot of these other like individual skeletons don't have a nickname, or they're just not as well known as Lucy. They're like.
Well, Donald Johanson, I think, was the one who ostensibly found the skeleton, the remains, the fossil of the Australopithecus afarensis, and named him from Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
Yeah.
At least that's the
Yeah, no, I
story.
think that's true, yeah. They were playing the song in camp because she was found in 1974. So they were playing the Beatles in camp and decided to nickname her skeleton Lucy.
Okay, so I've been having thoughts about Paranthropus.
Yeah, Paranthropus.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's such an interesting skull because it looks like there's, instead of a muzzle-like thing, you have this interesting continuous slope.
Mhm.
What's up with that?
Yeah, it's not one of the skulls that we have out on the,
right.
on those 5. So they had a very like sort of sloping face. And then what you can't really see with the hair is those are the fossils that had that ridge down the middle, the sagittal crest. So just a different kind of configuration of the base.
So there were Klingons, actually.
That's where I went with it, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think they were
Kind of.
Klingons.
Yeah.
Of course, then there is the Homo heidelbergensis, which I like to refer to as our grandparent species. Or our parents, well, our parent
Grandparent,
species.
yeah.
Actually,
that's
Homo
your
erectus
parent.
is, Homo erectus is part of our grandparent species, and Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals are cousins.
And inventors of the man bun.
That's right.
And then, of course, it's a really interesting species that's around about the same time, and very small in stature, on the island of Florence.
Flores in
Florence.
Indonesia.
And seem to be the result of island dwarfism, where species that find themselves isolated on a particular island where there's limited resources, it's adaptively advantageous to not need as much of those resources. And so those offspring that, as a matter of fact, are smaller in size, have a tendency to be better able to survive. And then there's us. How many have seen this picture before? Could this be Jesus? No, it's a combination of it's a forensic combination of 3 first-century Galilean skeletons. He certainly doesn't look like the Salzman Jesus, which is probably one of the most popular Jesuses that there's around. It doesn't certainly look like he's Western Europe and so forth. But anyhow, this is sort of the the picture of our immediate relatives that are part of our immediate family tree amongst the hominids. And all of them had their own ways of life. And I always like to point out that Homo erectus is the one who gave us the control and management of fire. I wanted to say they also provided habitats, but I think that's later on, actual, not constructed external.
Yeah, that's probably more like Homo heidelbergensis,
Yeah.
I think, or
Yeah.
Neanderthals, yeah.
Now, what has happened is that our particular species has learned to live in lots of different places. We are probably the most invasive species there has ever been. We live in where it's absolutely cold. We live where it's absolutely hot. We actually live out of not on the earth at all, and in between. You saw where the astronauts been up there for
Oh,
a
yeah.
longer trip than they thought. So we are a species that now have spread from, I don't know how many, some say that at one particular time, our species was down to 10 or so thousand reproductive adults. We're now 8 billion. Over,
How did they come up with that kind of number? Just out of curiosity, how did they get?
So it's mathematical modeling based on how genetically similar we are. And the idea is that humans may have gone through kind of a genetic bottleneck where there were very few kind of breeding adults. And the 10,000 is like actually a fairly large estimate. The smallest one I've seen is 600. So, and that it would have been kind of a population crash or a long time of just a generally really low level of population.
so from the time, and this is somewhat after the 300,000 year origin
Oh,
of our
definitely.
species. So it's a period of time in which our species ran a real risk of becoming extinct.
But yet we didn't. That's
No,
interesting.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
now we just populate the earth. I mean,
Now
we're everywhere. Now and there, we're all kinds of variety. So, we back to Will and. See if we can get this- there we go.
But how can both be true?
My voice
Well,
hasn't changed yet.
It's because the Bible isn't a science text, but also the sciences do not provide the ultimate framework for understanding who we are in the grand scheme of things. The writers of the Bible told their story using the common understandings of nature in their day. What else could they use? At the same time, their intuitions about how to answer the question, what does it mean to be human, are still in many ways as true today as they were thousands of years ago. And the sciences help us to appreciate those insights in a more detailed and deep way. You know, even if there weren't two actual people named Adam and Eve, who were the originating parents of all human beings, as the Bible tells the story, the sciences of human origins have shown us that all human beings do have, in fact, a family relationship with one another, and that we need one another, and that we need one another.
Okay, that was,
Yeah, it's interesting. It was reported to me by one of the docents that we had somebody walking through the exhibit who asked the question, which one of these is Adam and Eve? As they looked at various skulls and the reconstructions. And you never, the trouble for me is, I hear that secondhand, so I don't know whether it was ironic, facetious.
Exactly.
You know,
Humorous.
Trying to
or
avoid
serious,
serious,
right?
Yeah.
Did she say how she answered the question, or he
No,
answered the
no.
question? No. That would have been the.
we'll
I
see.
don't know, which one do you think?
Yeah,
Turn it back on.
We'll see whether this works or not. I would like to think it does. Okay, it
there
did.
you go.
Why did they have to do it?
Oh, me, I'm up.
Oh.
Mommy, why did the dinosaurs have to die?
Oh, that's my favorite.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's what my son asked. years ago.
Oh, okay. I thought, okay. Ask Diana as they left the Science Center's traveling dinosaur exhibit. I thought God loved all his creatures. You know, we sing that song in church about all things bright and beautiful, all things great and small. The good Lord made them all. But if God made them and God is love, why did they all have to die?
Yeah, my son asked why weren't they on the boat with Noah?
They missed the boat.
The problem. This is the classic statement of the problem. If God is all good and God is all powerful, why is there evil? So freshman or sophomore students late in the night argue this question.
Yeah.
Does the next slide have the answer? This is
I
great.
know, exactly. You know you're
And
gonna
this
get
is
the answer.
classically what's known as theology. You have this quote, now this is actually prior to Darwin, this is a quote from Alfred Lord Tennyson, poem In Memoriam. So careful of the type, but no. From scarped cliff and quarried stone, she cries, 1,000 types are gone. I care for nothing, all shall go. Thou makest thine appeal to me, I bring to life, I bring to death. The spirit does not need the breath. I know no more. And he shall heed man her last word, who seemed so for such splendid purpose in his eyes, who rolled the song in wintry skies, who built him fanes of fruitless prayer, who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw, with revenge shrieked against his creed. Yeah, this is the whole notion of extinction of that, the new geology that had already emerged well before Tennyson was actually born, was beginning to show the vast amount of death that had been part of the natural history of the world with the extinction of all these other creatures, that many of whom were strange and were no longer around. We have our favorite story about this in terms of our late visit. But even in the Bible, you have these sort of issues too. Of course, this is a depiction of Job with his visitors, a man who was innocent by all accounts, and yet has one disaster after another placed upon him. And it's set in the context of a story in which God and Satan are having this bet about who is going to take all the good stuff away from Job, and he's going to end up cursing you for sure. Well, Job does complain. But in the end, what's interesting is that God takes Job on a tour of creation, so to speak. It shows him all of these other living, wondrous creatures doing their thing and enjoying the creation and so forth. And sort of asked Job, and where were you when I decided to create things? Did I take your advice on? And eventually, Job submits himself to the authority or the majesty of God, whatever. This is not a serious aspect story for a lot of people, and people will turn to Job as an example of sort of unwarranted suffering, regardless of fact that he got. And for Christians, of course, the prime example of this is the cross. Innocent man who's put to death. But it says God so loved the world. That's one of the things that the Christians claim. They say, love your neighbor as yourself. You find this not only in the New Testament, you find it in the Old Testament as well. Quoted in Matthew, Matthew's probably quoting Mark, and Mark is quoting Leviticus. And even the Gospel of John says God is love. So love seems to be a prevalent notion, at least within the context of the Christian community. So I'm going to offer a proposal. If God is love, then the creation is an expression or incarnation of God's love. Then creatures are themselves an expression or an incarnation of God's love. But creatures are called to participate in the work of creation. Then creatures are called to express or incarnate love in their participation in the work of creation. But I won't get to the but quite yet.
It's always a but.
The notion about creation, creatures are called to participate in the work of creation. There are actually three examples that in the first chapter of Genesis. Twice God calls upon the earth to bring forth the next stage of creation, and once upon the seas to do so. So already you have this notion of participatory creation in the book of Genesis. So you don't get extra biblical on that. But love is a gift. Love cannot be coerced. So love must be expressed in a context of freedom. But in a free context, all outcomes are not necessarily loving. So there's a possibility that creaturely acts meant to be expressions or incarnations of love may not be loving but evil. So, this is not a QED here. No, it's not. So, evil is a necessary potential due to the freedom required for a creation called to incarnate love. If this is a proposal, it's not necessarily an answer to the question, but it's a way of thinking about it that doesn't solve the problem of suffering and so forth. There are also matters about how you think about God that's involved in here as well, quite beyond the whole notion that talking about God's relationship with love. It's also the power of God and that sort of thing that's involved. I'm not dealing with that here. But it's a way of thinking about unwarranted suffering. It may not, it's not necessarily being caused by God, but it may be caused by that creature that's participating in creation, but not so as to incarnate or express love. Liz?
You know, kiddo, sometimes you ask the hardest questions. What you're asking about is one of the hardest questions anyone at church, even Pastor Mike, could ever try to answer.
But I want to know. It seems mean for God to kill the dinosaurs.
First, it's not quite right to say that God killed the dinosaurs any more than God killed your grandfather, who lived to be 96, or that God killed Goldie, your goldfish, last year. Part of being one of God's creatures is that we have both a beginning and an end. We are born and we die. Actually, we do have some dinosaurs still around. That cardinal outside the window there is a descendant of dinosaurs from long ago, just like you are a descendant of Grandpa Joe.
This goes on and on. I'm sorry, this is not tracking, but go ahead.
Another thing, God's love does not depend on how long a thing lives. As the song says, God loves all creatures great and small. It could also say long-lived and short-lived as well. There are some parts of God's creation that last much, much shorter than the blink of an eye, but God loves them as much as that tortoise we saw at the zoo that was more than 100 years old.
But I guess what I don't understand, Mommy, is why anything has to suffer or die if God loves them.
That's a really mysterious and hard question. Truthfully, I don't think anyone has the final answer to it. But maybe one way to think about it is like this. If I could control everything you did so that you would never make a mistake or hurt yourself, would you still be my lovely Diana who sometimes skins her knee and asks the darndest questions? You might be an indestructible robot like the ones Will battles in his video game, but you would not be you. You are full of surprises just like the rest of God's creation. And sometimes those surprises can hurt. But because you're free to be surprising, you are also free to love. Love is a gift that we give. It isn't something that can be required or programmed in. The freedom that makes love possible is the same freedom that makes life risky. And I can tell from your expression that I'm not being real clear, but that is part of the problem with your very good question. Any answer seems to be murky to start with.
So that's the section on status. We have a little more time there. Rather than going through any of these others, what I want to do is to kind of skip to the end if I can do that. One of the things I want to do is have this quote from Teilhard de Chardin. Someday, after we have mastered the winds, the waves, the tides of gravity, we will harness for God the energy of love. Then, for the second time in the history of the world, humanity will have discovered fire. One of my favorite quotes. No, I'm not sure. No, that is too quick to the end. I shows I'm still working to get this. So let me get this straight, because one of the things I want to do before then is to do this. When you're trying to talk about the relationship between science and religion, particularly when you're talking about what science has discovered about the creation or the cosmos. You just haven't got enough time to do that. So what I try to do is identify 6 cosmic features. One is that everything is changing. That's become a mantra of my older daughter. Everything is changing. Everything is connected to everything else. We've discovered that in amazing ways with this whole notion of quantum entanglement. Everything is its relations. You can have what you might call the artichoke theory of reality, which is kind of an essentialist theory that things have their essence, and then everything else around them is just sort of accidents. And if you peel an artichoke, what you finally get is the
Heart.
heart.
Oh, yeah.
You get the heart. On the other hand, this refers to an onion theory of the universe, reality, and that is when you start peeling an onion, what do you get in the end?
Years.
Yeah,
That may be true, but you don't get anything else.
just the onion.
Just, well, you don't get, what do you do get?
You eat nothing.
You eat nothing,
Yeah.
you know, nothing. And that's because, in one way of saying it, an onion is made completely of its relationship. You take away the relationships, the more onion.
Huh, yeah.
In particular, it's not just relations, everything is its history. We think about that in terms of genetics, our genetics are this whole history of biological evolution that has led to us. And every one of us in here is different because that's how relationships is different, Rachel. Everything could have been and will be different. We understand the world is a probabilistic place. Things happen because they're probable, but it doesn't mean they're necessary. It's necessary that they're probable, but their particular outcome is not necessary. Because it's different. One of the chapter on accident or design, plan or accident deals with this question. And then there's deep space and deep time. What reason I list these is because it seems to be in doing Christian education, or for that matter, preaching, or any of those sort of educational or quasi-educational activities. This is the world in which we're talking about. And so whatever we're saying, either in our education or a thing, this is the thing that is going to test whether or not what we're saying is credible or not. Otherwise, we're talking about a world that's other than the world we live in. I want to talk about the deep space and deep time. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen this, the James Webb Deep Field image. This is one of the first images that came off of the Webb telescope. Do you all know how this was made? Yeah. Well, first of all, it looked at a portion of the sky that would be as large as a grain of sand held at arm's length, in which there appears to be, of course, it's hard to see what appears there at all, but it appears to be nothing. And then they cumulatively, they looked at it for 12.5 hours. That's enough of the light shine on the receptors to be able to get images. What do you think they found? 45,000, more than 45,000 galaxies, not stars, galaxies. All those dots that you've seen here are galaxies. Some of them are galaxies that have been sitting light for 13 billion years.
And they're gone.
Well, and well, probably.
Yeah, they're probably gone.
Probably all, now they're probably gone, right? There's that line in the movie Contact, in which at the very end, where one of the kids are at the big array and are asking Jodie Foster's name, I can't remember, Arrowwood, whatever I said, Arrowwood, I don't know, anyway, asking her if there is life on other planets. And her response is, well, if there isn't, it's an awful waste of space.
Yeah.
And yet theologically, we pay no attention to this. I mean to say we will look at it and wonder God's wondrous creation and so forth. But it's more than that. This is a realm this is a universe that's filled with being of all sorts of stuff. And we just know hardly anything about it. Even in the grand scheme of things, 70% of the universe is made out of dark energy that we have not the foggiest idea what it is. So we're not quite sure what the 20% that's dark matter is. So there may be some candidates. So it's only about, what, not 10% of ordinary matter that we know anything about.
We used to think it was empty,
We thought it was empty.
remember?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's deep space, but there's also deep time. And this is an illustration I like to use. I heard someone use another illustration the other day, which I thought was a good one too. They talked about someone actually drew a line in the desert. It was a very long line.
Yeah, I just saw that.
Yeah. I don't have an ability to do a long line in the desert, so I did a set of books. So here are a set of volumes. That's the history of the universe. And 28 volumes. Each volume has 100 pages, and each page is the beginning. Tell the story. Well, of course, the Big Bang count, page 1, volume 1, page 1. Interestingly enough, the first stars are pretty soon. They're still in volume 1, page 100. Now you have to twiddle your thumbs a very, very long time before you finally get to the Earth, because it's not until you get down to volume 19. I wonder what was God doing all that time? That's a long nap or something. I don't know. But that's part of the problem is our thinking that the whole of creation is about us. And this suggests at least not only that picture of the deep field, but this in terms of time is that there's quite a lot of time that's going on in creation before they were got around to, and this is not even us. This is just the Earth. But interestingly enough, life shows up about 1 billion years after that. So it looks like, at least in given certain conditions, that if you have those conditions, it doesn't have long for life to emerge. And we know something about what's called convergent evolution. That is where you have the appearance of certain biological forms in very disparate creatures who have no direct evolutionary connection. They do have an evolutionary connection, but it's way, way back. They're not in their sort of direct line of descent. But they seem to be very functional forms that in a variety of environments are useful in work. So our camera eye and the camera of the octopus are very similar. You'd have to go way, 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 way back. Okay, life. Well, then you have a Cambrian explosion, as I was saying. And I put the quote, that's a page, volume 27 page, I think it says 250 or something, I can't see it. 60, okay. Whoops, I did it again. Here we go. It occurred over about a 60 million time period, so it wasn't a big, fast, boom explosion. And this is one of those situations which and Rick was talking about, and Brianna also, that there are, and you see this in a variety of other circumstances where conditions can build and build and build and build, but nothing seems to be happening. And then all of a sudden, boom, all kinds of things happen. Cascading events of one kind or another. And that appears to be a case in terms of general evolutionary process as well. In fact, it's Stephen Jay Gould and
Nas Eldridge.
Niles Eldridge came up with this notion of punctuated equilibrium.
Yeah.
That things stay sort of the same for a long period of time, then all of a sudden there's a whole lot of development that occurs with that. Well, of course, our lackluster, not lackluster, our doomed dinosaurs, they're really, they're in volume 28. And on page 235, almost halfway through the book. And we show up finally on the last page, the last paragraph on page 400, not the end of the book. Because the end of the book hadn't been written yet. It's still being written. But you can see how much time has gone on and how much that has happened has made possible what we are today. which again is a thing, it seems to me, it's not a thing that you bring into any Christian education class or whatever you're teaching and so forth. It's background, it's framework, it's the thing that we recognize when we start talking about God's creation. And that leads me to, I would say, some educational presuppositions. It's insufficient to speak of God's creating in the past tense. I try to avoid using created when I talk about God. It's not that you can point to the past and say, well, God created that. But it's important to say that creation process is still going on. It's continuing. Because God is creating now. We participate in God's creative activity. You already see that in Genesis, that recognition that that's the case. And as I've said in early things, we continue to participate in that. So our participation is important. We do not have a history. We are our history. That's the whole, again, a nod to the reality of evolution for us personally. And we are not only our genome, we are our genome. That is not only what our biological inherent is in terms of our genetics, it's also the things that happen to us as we live down through our lives, who we meet, who we learn from, the accidents that we have, the scars that we get, the illnesses that we contract. All of those are part of who we are. So how do you know who a person is? Well, you don't know until they're dying, because they're still building themselves all up to that point. This is what philosophically would be called an existentialist view of life rather than an essentialist view of life. The essentialist view of life, you become what you are. In an existentialist view of life, you are what you become. Homo sapiens are kin to every other form of life on earth. That notion of kinship, Homo sapiens are kin. We have a family relationship with everything else. Just in most families that we know about, there sometimes are family members that we have a hard time getting along with. That would certainly be true of every pathogen that we work very hard to eradicate or whatever. But it's also the case that the human genome itself has marks of the inclusion of viruses. So viruses contributed to our formation. That's part of our history. We are the beneficiaries of forms of life that have come before us, particularly the hominin species. We inherit an awful lot from them in terms of our own survivability in the world and so forth, and the gifts that they've given us. And the future will be, in part, what we do now in response to God's call to do justice, love, kindness, walk humbly, quote from Micah. And the future will be what we do now. The future is not reset. The future is not something that's happening out there. It's something that we're participating in making. That's particularly germane to our current circumstance with regard to the environment. Again, for me, these are presuppositions that need to lie as part of the background of whatever topic you're doing in Christian education. That these are things that you don't think about them all the time. In fact, you almost want to get them so you don't think about them at all. They simply orient or frame the way in which you go about doing the work you do. Okay, that was that quote. That's it.
Love that, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We are at 8 o'clock, and I don't know whether people have questions or comments.
I'm willing to answer if there are any who do.
We do have one request for your materials,
Oh,
so I'll get that email to you.
It was jam packed, lots of.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. There's just been so much to
Yeah, but
take in.
it's not over today. I hope all of you will find a moment to come to chapel tomorrow when Rick Potts will be giving the message at 11 o'clock.
You know,
It's a short service, usually over in 45 minutes.
I'll
So,
all sit in the background and say, hallelujah.
yeah, amen.
Preach on.
Yeah, yeah. Freak him out. This will be Rick's first time delivering the homily. You know, lay people sometimes are new at that. But he's talking about how science is in a way an inspiration for his Christianity. And then tomorrow night, his lecture begins at 7. Also, all of these available online as well as in person. So you can ask your questions all week. Then, yeah, a nice sequel to this would be the Science Educator Workshop, which has, I hope you'll get to some of those great modules that
Oh,
you've
yeah.
been testing
Yep.
in AP
Yep.
science classes. And finally, a whole community conversation on Thursday, where I think we could clean up unfinished business for folks there, couldn't we?
Sure.
Yes,
In part,
definitely,
yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So bring your questions and your comments and your bright ideas. And we'll be glad to see you again. Register for those if you will, so we know how to plan and so you get the information you need if you want to be online.
And I want to say something general about the work that Brianna does, and she and my former colleague, Connie Burkett, worked with her. And that is developing modules for teaching science education in high school, high school
Science
setting,
classes,
science
yeah.
classes. They started out with AP classes, but then they brought them out to just general biology
yeah.
classes. But not only really up-to-date material and so forth, and using human examples in order to teach evolution, but also providing a resource for teachers to help them to be sensitive to the cultural perspectives that kids bring into the classroom.
Yep, so that'll be the first whole half of the science
In a way,
educators
it's
workshop on
modeling the very kind of
Wednesday at
thing
4:30.
that we generally try to do with regard to the exhibit itself. And that is to
Yeah,
be able to stimulate the sort of, we like people to understand and know what's in the exhibit. But we want to do that in a way that is respectful to the perspectives that people bring.
Yeah,
And is open
exactly.
to hearing what people have to say about it.
I hope I know pretty much everybody in the room has filled out the survey, so I won't have you do that again. But if you haven't already, put your Post-it up on answering the question, what does it mean to be human? And I see Tiana has even put in the chat a way for
Yeah.
people who are online to be a part of that conversation and to complete the survey. So I think we should say thanks to everybody. Some people have been traveling a lot today and yesterday. So come back tomorrow, please. It'd be
Yeah.
great to have you.
Thanks for coming back again today.
Yeah, I'm impressed.